Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the board. My name is Ethan Beckham. I am a history major senior. My presentation today will be covering gunfighters, outlaws, gangsters, U.S. Marshals, and G. This was a paper I did for my history seminar class, and I would like to present it with everyone else. My presentation does say gangsters and outlaws, but it will cover all areas of the entire paper. I do have my abstract on here, which goes to state gunfighters, outlaws, and gangsters brought about the way laws and lawmen changed and developed skills in order to be able to track criminals and arrest them. Judges and courts set precedents for punishment to fit the crimes. This paper presentation will argue how throughout history these lawmen and gangsters, these outlaws and gangsters and lawmen and law enforcement groups influenced each other. Some of these nefarious outlaws, gangsters even managed to change the way the lawmen and law enforcement evolved to handle the way criminals and criminal activities were investigated, sought after, and punished. Many towns across the West faced the rise of unruly, often outnumbering good citizens. The Oklahoma Territory population was mostly some who found refuge from and outside of the law and court system, at least until the establishment of the Western District U.S. Court in Fort Smith, Arkansas. Lawmen were needed to help guard against and control the outlaws and gangsters. The U.S. Marshals began with George Washington, and the Texas Rangers were started in 1835. Throughout time, outlaws and law have battled to stay one step ahead of the other. Wild West era criminals would have no chance of surviving against the lawmen today. The advancements made in criminology have given the law a much better advantage against their opponents. Early lawmen started out on horseback. Those horses that were usually used were thoroughbreds, meaning they were pure blood horses. For example, buckskins, or paints, which are some of the ones I keep track of, and I know that were used. Some law enforcement still do use horses today. I know that New York City is one example, and a lot of the northeast of the United States is actually still using horseback or mounted officers. They're professionally called. Horses made it easier to travel and catch criminals. For the example, that horses can obviously outrun humans without a doubt. So it allowed them to actually catch up and sneak up on criminals a lot easier because horses also will probably be a little bit more quiet. Early crime. Criminals did not have access to vehicles. This is obvious until the first invention of vehicles, which I will cover in a couple slides. Most criminals usually stole their transportation, which were horses. Occasionally, some did steal carriages as well. That way they could actually transport their loot and gold to the locations. Jesse James, who is actually pictured here on the slide, constantly used horses. He was known for it. Him and his entire band would steal horses and use them as they needed and saw fit. He is not one of the only ones, because going even further back in history, there are even Indians who would do the same thing. The inventing of the car. First car was invented in 1885, which would be the Fords. First ever cop car was a wagon, which was in 1899. That actually will be pictured here in a little bit on another slide. The first V6 engines were invented in 1905, which were later followed up by the V8s in 1910. Early on, the police vehicles would be V6s and pretty much continued to be V6s for quite some time until I want to say about the 1940s, 1950s. They were able to finally start catching up with criminals that were getting away with using the V8s, which one criminal I will be listing here in just a minute did use V8 vehicles, and that was his preference. Crime heightens. Automobiles were used, as I kind of stated a little bit. The first ever police vehicle was a buggy, which I had stated in my previous slide, and as I said, will be pictured here in a little bit. Heavier artillery became a thing, which was automatic and semi-automatic rifles, because early on there were pistols until rifles started coming out, and it was a lot more common, especially for criminals. Usually got their hands on stronger and better weapons than most any of them. Bonnie and Clyde in the B8s. As I was stating in my previous slide, Clyde's preference was the Ford B8s. He knew he could outrun and get away from the law a lot faster using a V8 versus their V6s. If he was going to steal a vehicle, he always made sure that it was a V8, and he preferred the V8 Fords. The vehicle that they had actually used was a 1934 Ford four-door, which did have a V8 engine in it. That was the vehicle that they were killed in, but that was his preference of vehicle. Clyde also, as listed on here, as his favorite gun was the Browning automatic rifle, or the BAR. And this was his preferred weapon because it was stronger and could fire off more rounds a lot quicker. And ironically enough, he was actually killed with his very own favorite gun that when they were ambushed. Bootlegging, which was brought about during the Prohibition era, which was known as the illegal transport of alcohol. This is very common and is still actually a crime committed today a lot in the Appalachian Mountain area, which there is a whole entire TV show on that kind of covers of how it was done even back in the day and how they're still doing it now. The use of cars in crime increased, more vehicles being produced, more vehicles being put out, so criminals were able to get their hands on vehicles a lot more, along with some that even use their own. Heavier and faster sports cars became popular, which obviously as time progressed, vehicles progressed, and a lot of them would even tinker and experiment with their own vehicles to make them faster and stronger so that they could outrun the law a lot easier, which then obviously brought about the inventing of NASCAR. Bootlegging is the whole purpose that NASCAR was invented, because it would be a race of between one bootlegger and another of who could get across the country a lot faster, or across their area faster, to deliver their illegal alcohol to pubs, bars, and speakeasies. Along with going back to the use of cars in crime increased, one thing that was well known for by Bonnie and Clyde's group, Clyde would always make sure to carry plates with him so he could switch out plates and get away with his crime a lot easier because of using in-state plates. As soon as he crossed the state line, he'd pull over and hide to where he could switch out his plates so that his vehicle did not seem suspicious. Upgrades. Police finally started to use V8 Fords, which I'd said was about the 1940s, 1950s. They were able to keep up with criminals now that they had stronger and faster vehicles. The National Criminal Information Center, the NCIC, was invented, which kept track of mostly fingerprints and names and criminal history. They, as of in January of 2019, are now able to do DNA tracks as well. They have DNA on file, so they're able to see if a criminal was DNA pulled or not. So for their crimes, if their DNA was found at a crime scene or other situations. That was also the buggy that I was stating there as well. Then versus now. Early criminals and law enforcement, horseback was used, so a lot of criminals and lawmen used horseback to get around and get away. Revolvers were pretty much the only reliable type of firearm at the time, which obviously made taking out criminals a lot harder and a lot more difficult. Along with no database, they had no DNA, no fingerprints, or anything, or any way, shape, or form to track the criminals and to keep track of them. Evolution, which would be getting more into our time here, cars, which later use of V8 engines, as I had stated that V8 engines came out, which made it a lot easier, allowed the lawmen to keep up with criminals. Heavier artillery, as I had stated, rifles and semi-automatic and automatic rifles were created, which allowed easier ability to obviously get off more rounds and also take out criminals as needed. And then the NCIC, the National Criminal Investigation Center, was invented, or Information Center, was invented, which allowed them to keep track of information on the criminals that had either been booked or caught or were since passed. And here are also some personal and local connections. Pictured here is Belle Starr on horseback. Machine Gun Kelly's mugshot, which is actually in color. Also have Bonnie and Clyde pictured in the middle. A wanted poster of Pretty Boy Floyd and his house that is actually here in Fort Smith. Bass Reeves, who was a well-known U.S. Marshal, and a personal connection for me, which is Major Elias Rector down in the far corner. Some local connections to Fort Smith are Belle Starr, Bonnie Parker, and Clyde Barrow, and Pretty Boy Floyd. Belle Starr was a famous outlaw in Indian Territory. She was murdered as she was leaving from accompanying her lover Jim July to Fort Smith. She died in 1889 from a gunshot wound to the back. Her daughter Pearl owned a bordello near the famous Miss Laura's, which is now the Fort Smith Visitor Center located in downtown Fort Smith. Bonnie Parker and Clyde Barrow and his brother Buck Barrow hid out in Fort Smith after Bonnie was injured in a car wreck while they were leaving the scene of a robbery they committed in Texas. Clyde and Buck robbed the Southern Tobacco and Candy Company of Fort Smith. The store was located on Zero Street but has since been torn down. They have also robbed the Chevrolet that used to be down there as well. Charles Arthur Floyd, known as Pretty Boy Floyd, had a hideout near Tillis Park and owned a home on the corner of Kincaid and May Avenue, which is the picture that is present here. I cannot find the picture for the house over, I believe it's North 39th next to Tillis Park. The U.S. Marshals were created by a Senate bill that was signed by George Washington on September 24, 1789, as part of the Judiciary Bill. Washington appointed 13 marshals over a 2-day period, and they would be placed in the new federal districts. Originally, they served warrants, subpoenas, and other papers, but were also responsible for making arrests. Texas Rangers were established in 1835. With the West, especially Indian Territory, becoming a problem, the appointment of Judge Isaac Parker to the Western District in 1875 was to help control the crime. He appointed 200 marshals in his time, one of those being Bass Reeves, who is pictured. He was born a slave in 1838 during the Civil War and escaped to Indian Territory, where he learned the language and ways of the Seminole and Creek Indians. Reeves became a free man in 1865. He served for over 32 years and was the first African American west of the Mississippi. He made over 3,000 arrests and killed 14 outlaws. And for the personal connection that I have is Elias Rector. He was appointed a U.S. Marshal in 1831 and later served as the Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He did his best to make treaties with the tribes he interacted with. His service spanned 16 years under 4 presidents. His tenure ended in 1846, and his cousin Henry Mass Rector succeeded him and served until 1848. Mass Rector served as governor of Arkansas from 1860 to 1861. But this is my presentation, as I said, covers gunfighters, outlaws, gangsters, U.S. Marshals, and G-men. Thank you for your time.